This pathway for the nerve impulses from the ear is going to start obviously here at the cochlea. Signals are going to travel through this cochlear branch. That branch is going to merge with the vestibular branch. All of those signals are going to be carried through the vestibulocochlear nerve, to a nucleus in the medulla oblongata, and then to the inferior colliculus sometimes. They're going to synapse there. And then from there to the thalamus for another synapse, and then to the auditory cortex. And the auditory cortex is then actually going to make sense of the sounds and interpret what is heard. And remember that all of these signals, all action potentials, are just electrical signals. So building on that, that's how a cochlear implant can restore hearing to someone who has a certain types of hearing damage or hearing loss. If the hearing loss is because of structures in the ear, then a cochlear implant can create the electrical signals that will be interpreted by the brain as action potentials. So what they do is they take a transmitter that's attached to the outside of the head and a receiver and an antenna that are actually under the skin on the skull. And there's a little wire transmitter lead that carries electrical impulses into the cochlea, and those stimulate the cochlear nerve directly, and then those signals are taken by the cochlear nerve into the brain and then interpreted as sound. So that's how a cochlear implant works. It literally bypasses all of the mechanisms that translate sound waves into electrical signals, creates the electrical signals directly, and transmits them to the cochlear nerve. All right, so that's all we learned there. All these parts, we learned all about the cochlea. Now let's go to this part, the vestibule and the semicircular canals. So the vestibular complex is going to interpret equilibrium. The vestibule is this area here, which is filled with fluid and then filled with tubes that are further filled with fluid. And it contains several structures. There's the utricle, the saccule here, and then the semicircular canals with an ampulla at the end of each of those canals. Within the utricle and the saccule, there are hair cells, much like the ones in the cochlea, and they have little stereocilia at the top, and these stereocilia are embedded in a gelatin layer. This is a thicker, denser layer than the mucus layer we see elsewhere. And in this gelatin layer, there are these little crystals called otoliths. They basically give this gelatin a little more density and a little more weight. So what happens when you move your head? Imagine that your head is moving this way. This otolithic membrane, this gelatin layer, is going to lag behind a little bit. It's going to fall behind and then move forward with the head. And as it does that, it pulls on these hair cells. And as these hair cells pull, they're going to open sodium channels that are going to rush in and cause an action potential. And then that action potential gets sent down the vestibular branch. So which ones of these cells get bent, how far they get bent, how long they stay bent, all of those things will be interpreted as movement by the brain. Now in the semicircular canals, we have a slightly different setup. Each of the canals sits on a plane We have an anterior one, a posterior one, and a horizontal one. And each canal has a duct in the middle that's filled with fluid. And then at the within those, we actually have not just a simple one canal, but we have actually this kind of more complex space filled with fluid. The ampullae are these little swellings at the base of the semicircular canals. And as you turn your head in any direction, the fluid in the canals moves. So if you tilt your head forward and back, the fluid along that vertical canal is going to move, but the horizontal one won't move as much. When you twist your head side to side, the horizontal fluid moves, the vertical doesn't move as much. So the movement of the fluid in here is going to cause movement at this ampulla. Within the ampulla, here's the ampulla here. Within the ampulla, there's this little crista ampullaris, which is this raised area, and then on top of that, there's this big cupula of gelatin, and embedded at the bottom of that are hair cells. So it's the same kind of mechanism where the movement of this cupula of gelatin is going to move these hair cells, and as those hair cells move, they will open sodium channels, which cause action potentials that then get transmitted down this vestibular branch of the cochleovestibular nerve. Vestibulocochlear nerve. I don't know why I keep wanting to mix those up. So when you move your head in different directions, different canals get more movement, and different hair cells on different cupula move. And so your brain interprets the twisting and rotation of the head based on which signals it's getting from which hair cells in which ampulla. That's how your head knows which way it's going. So what happens when you get on a roller coaster and you spin around and go up and down and upside down, and then you get off and you're dizzy? What happens is that these cells get overstimulated, and they actually keep sending action potentials even after the movement has stopped. And the brain then continues to sense movement even though the actual movement has stopped. And this is why on most roller coasters, when you get to the end, the car stops before you get back to the station. So you actually pause, and you probably noticed that you pause while another car is in the station being loaded. But you don't actually need to wait for that other car. If there weren't a car there, you would still stop so that everyone's vestibular system can get back to equilibrium. And people don't stand up dizzy and fall over when they get off the roller coaster. So that's why that happens. All right, and that is the end of equilibrium.